So you've got a diagnosis, or you've recognized yourself in autism or ADHD content on TikTok or Instagram or YouTube. Somehow or another, you have come to the conclusion that you have autism, that you have ADHD, that you maybe have both. And now the question is, what do I do with this information? If you've been formally diagnosed, a lot of the times you get the diagnosis and then you get a good luck, and unfortunately, you don't get a roadmap for what comes next, what happens next. A lot of the content out there stops at the feelings and doesn't give you a whole lot of practical information. And it's great to process the feelings, to deal with the feelings. But we also need to think about, what do we do when we're ready to move? What do we do when we're ready to actually take action? So in this video, I'm just going to share a few practical steps that worked for me and that have worked for people close to me who have been diagnosed. I am not a clinician. This is not medical or psychiatric advice. This is just a rundown of a few things that I think were helpful and might be helpful for you. These things apply whether you are formally diagnosed or self-diagnosed, or if you're self-diagnosed and working toward a formal diagnosis. I'm going to talk more about formal diagnosis in a minute, but it's not always accessible. So if you recognize yourself in a lot of this neurodivergent content that's out there right now, I want you to know that that's valid too, and this video might help. So what's first? Well, the label of autism and the label of ADHD, they're actually quite broad. So I think that the first useful move is to figure out how it shows up for you specifically. Your traits, your triggers, where you struggle, and maybe where you don't struggle where others might. I did this through a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of reflecting. I did a lot of tracking of my own patterns. And I think that everything else really builds on this first step, because accommodations and systems that you build for yourself really only work if you know what you're accommodating. I'm easily overstimulated. That's one of my traits. I couldn't build out self-accommodations for being easily overstimulated if I didn't know that I was easily overstimulated. So figuring that out, tracking those patterns, writing things down, doing some research, reflecting, learning your actual profile is an important first step. This is all about becoming a little bit more self-aware, seeing yourself and your neurodivergence more clearly. The second step is thinking about formal assessment if you're self-diagnosed. Now, if you're already formally assessed, this one doesn't apply to you. If you're self-diagnosed, or if you are suspicious that you might be, then you have a decision to make. Are you going to pursue formal assessment, or are you going to not pursue formal assessment, or are you going to wait? There are real considerations here. Formal assessment, especially in the US, is not cheap. There are often wait lists, and there are access barriers. So deciding to pursue a formal assessment doesn't mean that it's going to happen instantly. Now, there are pros and cons to formal assessment. On one side, if you get an official diagnosis, that opens up some workplace accommodation possibilities, and it also opens up medication possibilities. On the other side, it's possible that you'll be stuck with a pretty hefty bill for the evaluation and the assessment. There may be a long wait list. You may be waiting for a while for that. And in our current political climate, an official label can put a target on your back. And that is just the unfortunate truth in the United States. I will say this: self-diagnosis is widely accepted in the ADHD, autism, ADHD, neurodivergent community. Plenty of people stop there on purpose. I started out as self-diagnosed and eventually moved toward formal assessment. It was not something that I was in a hurry for, mainly because I work for myself, so any accommodations that I would be looking for are things that I could just build into my own work and my own schedule. If workplace accommodations are really important to you, then obviously a formal assessment is going to be more important to you. So, formal assessment, making that decision is an important step as well. Step 3 is to find neurodivergent affirming professionals. If you want support, the quality of that support depends really heavily on whether the person understands neurodivergence. A lot of standard practitioners do not. No one really tells you how to figure out which one is which ones are neurodivergent affirming and which ones are not. There's a few questions that you can ask to help screen potential providers for whether or not they're going to be affirming. So here's a few questions that you can ask before booking or in a first session. with a provider. How much of your practice is neurodivergent clients? Because you want someone who's working with neurodivergent adults regularly, not someone for whom you would be a novelty. Question number 2, do you see neurodivergence as something to treat or manage, or as a difference to support? Their answer is going to tell you almost everything about their model. Next question, are you familiar with late diagnosed adults specifically? The late diagnosis experience is kind of its own animal, and someone who works mostly with diagnosed kids or people who were diagnosed as kids might not get it. If you're working with someone who's prescribing medication, a good question to ask is, how do you approach medication for adults, and how do you handle it if the first thing doesn't fit? You're checking here for collaboration rather than a one-size-fits-all kind of script. And then there's the practical questions like sliding scale payment, telehealth, whether they're even taking new clients, so that you aren't investing emotionally before you even know if it's viable. Here's the language you're looking for in their responses. These are the green flags. Neurodiversity affirming, which is pretty close to an industry term now for the supportive model, and a lot of good practitioners put it out there like on their website. Mentions of accommodations and support and working with the brain rather than fixing or correcting. Any sign that they see masking as costly rather than a good coping mechanism, since that is a marker that they understand the actual lived experience instead of what society wants to see more of. A strengths and challenges framing rather than a purely deficit one. So someone who will assess your strengths and as well as assessing what challenges you might have instead of saying like, oh, you're just deficient. And mention of self-diagnosed clients being welcome, which is a signal that they understand and respect access barriers and that they won't gatekeep. Now, here are the red flags. These are reasons to keep looking. Treating autism or ADHD as something to cure or fix. Anything that sounds like compliance-based or behavior modification approaches aimed at making you look less neurodivergent. A lot of older approaches are about appearing typical rather than actually feeling better. Dismissing self-diagnosis completely. That's a big red flag. Falling back on stereotypes, saying something like, you don't look autistic, or acting surprised that you have a job or are married. Framing your traits as only problems, with no sense that there's anything to support or work with. And then, for me specifically, a big red flag was anyone who pushed hustle-style productivity fixes that ignored capacity. And this is especially true for like coaches. Now, when you are looking for a professional, if you are looking for someone to help you with the medication process, if that is a path that you want to explore, that has to run through a prescriber. So that means finding a psychiatrist or someone else who can prescribe medication, and it's important to find someone who's going to be willing to walk through that process with you and not just throw medications at you and hope something sticks. Again, talk to a professional about what's right for you. I'm just speaking from my own experience here. But finding a psychiatrist who was willing to work with me and who really cared about my experience with the medications that we were trying made a world of difference. The next step is to put some accommodations in place, and the person who gives you a formal diagnosis can help you articulate those formal workplace accommodations and write a letter to your workplace explaining what you need and why you need it. But there are also more informal day-to-day accommodations that you can implement in your life. I think it makes a lot of sense for me to do a separate video with just a bunch of different practical accommodations. However, I will run through a few right now just to kind of get the wheels rolling on your own creativity and how you could accommodate yourself. First up is body doubling, working alongside someone either in person or on a video call, so the task that you're doing has company. Removing barriers. This one's kind of broad, so I'm going to give you some examples, but laying tomorrow's clothes out so that you have fewer decisions to make in the morning. Same principle, prepping the coffee the night before so that you have fewer steps to do in the morning. Externalizing your memory, so using a tool like Notion to build like a second brain so that you can capture everything out of your head and into one trusted place rather than trying to trust yourself to remember. The just look version of tasks that you dread, so opening your email or your bank account with no obligation to act, so no obligation to actually do anything or take any action, just looking, just opening and looking. This helps shrink the avoidance and makes it that much more likely that you will take action the next time. There are time and transition accommodations like visual timers, alarms, buffer time baked into everything, putting things on autopilot, so auto pay for bills, repeat grocery orders, so that they don't need that executive function every single time. There's a lot more, and I will go into these in future videos. And the next step is related. So building systems that fit your brain. All of those accommodations that I mentioned are part of building systems that actually work for your brain. A lot of the productivity and systems advice you find online is not made with neurodivergent minds in mind. They are built for neurotypical people. So a lot of times we have to take those systems and tweak them to fit our brains, rather than trying to squeeze our brains into those systems and then feeling like a failure because it didn't work for us. The next step is making your disclosure decisions. So figuring out the logistics of who you're going to tell, how you're going to tell them, when you're going to tell them. Plus, if you've gone the formal assessment route, figuring out what your rights are at work and how you're going to disclose in your workplace. This is a series of choices that you make per person and per situation. You are not obligated to tell anyone about your diagnosis status. However, disclosing can be really helpful and really useful depending on the person and the situation. And then the last step is to plug into your community and your resources. So these are like books, groups, Instagram accounts, tools that actually help. Check your local library for support groups or information, or ask the librarians for book recommendations. Librarians are your superheroes. There are a lot of great Discord groups online for late diagnosed autistic and ADHD folks, and there are a lot of great private communities that also offer a bunch of resources. Some of it is going to require some digging, so do it on a day when you have a little bit more energy. But plugging into your community is maybe simultaneously the scariest and the easiest action that you can take. But in my experience, the neurodivergent community online has been immensely gracious, immensely helpful. They are respectful of other people's experiences, and in general, it's a very positive place to be. So, to recap, learn your actual profile, decide about formal assessment, find neurodivergent affirming professionals, put some accommodations in place, build systems that fit your brain, make your disclosure decisions, and plug into community and resources. These are the steps that take you from diagnosis to a life that actually runs better, that works for your brain, that feels better. And you can work through them at whatever pace fits for you. There is no rush. I would love to hear where you are at in this process, what step you're on, one you wish you had known about sooner, or just tell me about your journey in the comments. I will see you next time.